Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So straight up, this is going to be a tricky one to do. It would be easy to talk about corporate greed, how Bobby Kotick doesn't have gamers' best interests in mind, and to fully support his removal from Activision Blizzard. That would feel good to listen to, it would feel good to write, and damn, it would feel good to record. But the news does not exist to make us feel good. Ultimately, it should exist to inform and to educate. So while I don't create news, I do see it as being my job to present a balanced and accurate summary of events that, is just more in line with reality, really. And that's where covering the Fire Bobby Kotick movement really is kind of challenging. So, to get you up to speed, Activision Blizzard laid off 8% of their global workforce, around 800 people. Why? Well, most coverage seems to indicate that this was because their already record profits were just not enough. And that's not really the full picture. Activision Blizzard essentially overhired in the past, having many overlapping roles within their organization. They also had a number of initiatives that did not pan out. So overall, they identified they have a large workforce, but are constantly starved of development resources. So they decided to reorganize the company to eventually have 20% more developers so they could ship more product. Of course, when you look at the output of Blizzard over the last few years being pretty stagnant, and you look at Activision having trouble as well, I think that, you can see the kind of simplistic logic that they had in saying that. Now, as I have pointed out, many times, stuff like community management and QA, they basically are development roles, and they have been cut. They're absolutely vital things, and those roles being understaffed within the company is of great concern for the quality of their products. Now, the main problem here is how these layoffs were actually done. They were very solid, they came after months of rumors, and really it's a terrible situation that produced a lot of suffering and anxiety, especially for the people who, for an example, were contract workers or temps and therefore have no severance and no benefits continuing, like healthcare. So we know why it happened, and I think the core worry that Activision Blizzard have about the output of their company is actually quite well founded, but I think we can all agree that the way in which these layoffs were executed was not good. Again, we have to remember that these jobs were not cut because they could not be afforded. These jobs were cut because these roles were no longer wanted, with the total reorganization costing an estimated $150 million for the company. Ultimately, many of these roles probably should not have existed in the first place. They likely existed due to, hubris, that sort of burning desire for scale and growth, and with that rapid growth coming at the expense of the organization's overall quality. We all know what it's like when there's a lot of hype and something grows too fast. There's many easy examples, like, say, their esports attempts. With Activision Blizzard, a lot of those are a case where, the one thing they seem to not want to have is grassroots support, because they launch these big, bloated tournaments, and they're often set up in such a way that the grassroots are suffocated, and it's all to get that big growth. Now, that's fine initially when there was the initial bump of views is there, but whenever the inevitable contraction happens, well, those jobs go, and that is indeed something that we saw with their esports teams at the Blizzard Arena. So, in summary, the company likely did need to reorganize itself. Why would it need to? Well, because of poor decision making in the past. The manner in which the jobs went is where we really do run into problems. However, most of that stuff is not tied to Bobby Kotick, and it's actually not tied to Activision Blizzard. It's tied to American labor law, because a company is going to do the bare minimum in order to be legally compliant. Obviously, it would be ideal if it did more than the bare minimum, and indeed, they kind of have a fiduciary responsibility to do the bare minimum and incur the smallest cost. Like it or not, that kind of is just how things are at the minute. Now, of course, when this happens to a large company, then it's a massive news story, but it's worth remembering that most of the company is SMBs, i.e. small and medium businesses, and the layoffs of this exact same manner happen on a daily basis to a far larger scale than with what we saw in Activision Blizzard. It's just not one big event, so it's not really reported on. So it's a highly visible story because of the scale of the company involved and of really all of our personal investment in those IPs, but it's a fairly typical thing that really does happen all the time. Now, companies growing unsustainably to the point where they have these organizational issues, it seems to be a constant problem. Just look at the media layoffs of early 2019, especially in the sort of the subsections that were specifically affected, and especially a lot of the dirty tricks that a lot of those media companies use to inflate their, monthly numbers to try to get that growth. And really, this has all led us to the Fire Bobby Kotick movement, as well as the calls for unionization. So let's hit Bobby first. From the view of the board and of the shareholders, Bobby just delivered a record year He identified future problems that the business would face, and then he implemented organizational changes to overcome those challenges. So he's done well in the short term, he has acknowledged their challenging medium-term problems, and he's supposedly set the company up for a more successful long-term future. And when you say it like that, what he did sounds good. And maybe it actually is the right decision for the business to make in a really cold, hard, spreadsheety way. To the Activision Blizzard board, it probably sounds reasonable, and that's likely why you saw the stock price go up after the earnings call. That is, of course, not how it feels outside of the financial world. And really, that's the thing. Turning on a dime like this allows them to be stronger for the future. However, that agility comes at the cost. The people who lost their jobs. And that is where the calls for unionization have came in. And it really is a fantastic economical topic. So unionization, it generally does have pros and cons, as most things do. What are the pros? Well, workers will feel more secure. But really this means that, people with better talent can be attracted and retained. The more skilled workers, they'll feel more safe, and that probably is good for the core of the business. It also means that employees, they'll have better protections, right? Things like better severance, better benefits, things like that when they're laid off, so they have a bit more security. From what I understand, in many countries, the law of the land actually covers those things, but that's just less the case in the United States, where it is a bit more of a free-for-all. So those are all like the good aspects of unionization and, collective bargaining and all that. So what are the downsides? Well, there is a decrease in organizational agility, meaning that it is harder for businesses to quickly adapt to a change in the market. And the often referred to example for this one is the American automotive crash. So after historical protests, the automotive industry of the US pretty much unionized, and that led to a lot of really well-paid jobs with great benefits. They were seen as a very viable pathway to the middle class. Well, at one point, the market shifted to favor smaller, more fuel-efficient cars that mostly came from the EU. The US companies were not able to adapt to that change quick enough, leading to a contraction in their business. And that meant, of course, that they made less money, but still had loads of workers with probably a little bit bloated salaries for the work that they were doing, plus great benefits and all of those things, leaving the companies in an even more rough economical spot, and eventually leading to horrific layoffs that were disastrous to many of the cities that were impacted, with some of those problems still being felt to this day. And really, that's kind of the core of it. The unions are great for workers' rights, and they can help to attract and retain talent in countries where a lot of those rights are not otherwise robust. However, they do also increase the cost of employment, and they do make it harder for companies to realign their organization to a shifting market, and that does, in a way, sort of reduce their competitiveness, which ultimately can lead to even more job losses. So a lot of that is the push and the pull. And as an example, as many people have pointed out, as an example in Kotaku's coverage, unionization is probably not going to prevent job losses, but the thing that it can do when job losses come is ensure that there are severance packages that are well set up and the benefits are dealt with, and it seems like that is particularly a problem in the United States. Now, as for my opinion on all of this stuff, well, look, I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm wary of both things. I'm wary of unions being a little bit too powerful because history is littered with examples of that being fine while the business conditions are good, but being disastrous when industries go into a tough spot. The US auto industry is one example. Much of the United Kingdom economy in the 1960s is another good example. However, when 800 people can just be summarily dismissed in one day, following rumors, and that's it, there is a fundamental problem, clearly. And I actually wonder if unionization is treating a symptom and not a disease. I don't think the calls for unionization are as greatly felt in countries that by default have stronger labor laws. However, once again, the macroeconomics of that can be called into question. While many have, as an example, praised the French labor laws for protecting Blizzard's employees in France, well, when you look at France, it has low GDP growth. It also has a very high unemployment rate of 9.3%, as opposed to the 4% of both the US and UK. Now, many would argue that overly strong worker protections in a world where we have a big globalized economy makes countries less able to compete for foreign investment, which leads to a worse job market with less jobs, even if those people who do have jobs are a bit more secure. And it's really hard to know the balance between those things. And as always, I think the ideal solution probably lies a little bit in between. I know that the UK does have weaker labour laws than the French, but stronger ones than the US. Maybe the situation here is for the slightly stronger American labour laws, maybe cutting out some of the most egregious problems, but without greatly, reducing their competitiveness. I mean, for now, a union probably does make sense, but if unionization is to happen, it needs to be reasonable, it needs to not be ran by people who think that profit is an evil word, and at the end of their articles, like one of the articles on this from Waypoint ended with "eat the rich." And if you're saying eat the rich, I mean, I get it, people are angry, but that's just not setting the ground for any form of productive path forward. Because ultimately, and as Kotaku pointed out in their coverage, your workers can have all the protection in the world, but if a business is not bringing in money, then there will be layoffs regardless. Now, it's good if there's a union there so that those layoffs happen in a good manner that doesn't destroy the lives of these people. But you've got to be, I guess, aware of that. Unionization is not a one-stop fix to the whole problem. So yeah, I mean, man, it's a hard topic, and I do feel like I'm really at the limits of what I can sort of say about it. Now, as for the Bobby stuff, well, he's not done anything out of the ordinary. If anything, his actions and, that of Activision Blizzard are a systemic problem. Bobby has made himself a bit of a public enemy, both his deeds and his words. I mean, the man really has showboated before. Calling to fire him, though, that's emotionally understandable, right? We don't like the man, we want to get rid of the man, but when you actually think about it, well, it's just an emotional thing, right? He's delivered strong results for the company, and he has made moves to fend off future problems. Now, personally, I would argue that those future problems exist because of his poor leadership in the past, but, still, it's a problem. Then as for the Iwata comparison, I mean, I do love the comparison. I have a great deal of respect for the man taking those pay cuts. However, it is true that when he took those notable pay cuts, Nintendo was in a worse position than Activision Blizzard. However, he really did say one thing that is extremely relevant, and it is how he never wanted to lay people off because he felt it was bad for morale and that it would drive away talent. And if anything, that is the key takeaway here, be it from Bobby literally being a doom boss with physical form or being the result of correcting a bad decision in the past. It is clear that whatever happened, it got to the point where it has severely damaged staff morale and the public image of Activision Blizzard. This will drive away talent. This will decrease the morale of the people who remain. I doubt that's going to be good for the quality of their products. If Bobby was fired, though, it likely wouldn't do anything because Bobby's actions are entirely typical of corporate America. And while many may be worshipping, as an example, Japanese corporate culture right now, I really think it's worth digging deeper there because Japan has massive work condition problems that are very well documented. Now, the personal responsibility aspect that sort of led to a bunch of that, maybe that led to Iwata taking his pay cuts, but overall, Japanese corporate culture does have this tendency to grind people into a pulp, with working conditions that are often quite a bit worse than their American counterparts. So to wrap this whole thing up, I think that both of these stories are, I don't want to say short-sighted, but there's a broader point, I think. Instead of talking about the economic systems that are actually responsible for these things happening, we've instead focused on a small number of villainous characters. In doing so, I think we risk not properly talking about the structural issues that are at the core of these job losses, and more importantly, the manner of their execution. And I think that is the more important thing. It's talking about ideas over people, whether it's Bobby or whether it's really any other CEO acting in a typical CEO-like fashion. What they do, their actions are a product of systems, and it's worth thinking about the systems, I suppose. Or at least I feel like that's the best way to have a dispassionate and grounded in reality conversation about job cuts and their role in society, how they're executed, and all of that stuff. Of course, I don't have a conclusion on what the ideal way for things to be are. I don't know how strong unions should be. I don't know how strong labor laws should be. I don't know any of that stuff. I'm not an economist, right? But I think that we can at least talk around the problem, and that can just help to achieve a little bit more clarity on what's going on. So please let me know what you think about this, especially any economists watching. I mean, I'd really be interested in what you